morning. We're thankful to have all our visitors here from Canada. God bless. So have some from other parts of the world. And I'm not sure exactly where do you live, Manuela? Italy? Germany? Germany. Okay, yeah, that's right. Ansbach is where her parents are from. But she teaches German, Italian, English. So she's a universal girl, and now she's here with us for a short time. Take our greetings especially. I want you to take my greetings, especially to your mom and your dad and your brother. So they put me up in their house, and I almost burned it down once, but that's another story. Okay. This morning, we're going to talk about the exclusive church. Now, that sounds like a pretty self-righteous title to begin with, but what it means is that the Church of God is exclusively for those who believe. That's what the title means. Not that we're exclusive in our membership or anything like that, but the meaning is the exclusive church. The church is the body of believers. And this was the very thing that was at the heart of the argument within the Reformation movement of the 16th century. We have the Anabaptists, who were the second front, called the second front of the Reformation, and what they believed was primarily that you had to be a believer to be baptized, and therefore child baptism didn't work, because how could a child believe? But the idea of child baptism comes from the thought that the society itself is the church. In other words, we have the word parish. And we don't mean to die, we mean the parish of believers, those who are part of the household of believers are the society itself. So in every society that has existed throughout time, when we go back to the beginning, even to the beginning of Nimrod's time and Babylon from the beginning, the whole system of the society was considered under the head of the king or the patriarch, which was also connected with or was himself the high priest of the society. So everyone in that society was forced, you might say forced, to be a member of that religion. And if you were not a part of that religion, then you were a heretic. Now, in the early times of the Christian church, Roman society was what is called a sacral society. Now, I tried to find that word in Spanish, and I think it's the same word. It doesn't mean sacred. It means a society that is set apart to worship a certain way. Because I can't say a certain god because they had many gods. So when we look at the society of Rome, there was one particular set of people that were set apart even by the Romans. And you know who those people were? They weren't the Christians. They were the Jews. Within the Roman culture, within the Roman society, the Romans allowed the Jews to be a separate society within that society. We found also that happened in Babylon, that the Babylonians allowed the Jews to be a separate society. The Persians also allowed that, the Greeks allowed that, and the Romans allowed that. So the Greeks, the Jews themselves, were learning to be a society within a society, and that is what they have been ever since. But they were a physical group of people which set themselves apart by their beliefs and practices, and particularly by the day which they worshiped on. Now, that somewhat changed to a certain degree in the time after Christ, because the Jews themselves were rebelling against the Romans, and the Romans kind of got angry with them. First they killed a lot of them in Jerusalem, and then there was others who went to war with Rome, and Rome was very angry with the Jews, and many of them died because they rebelled against Rome, because they wanted to set up their kingdom again in Jerusalem and went to make war to have that promise fulfilled that they thought should be fulfilled to them as a people. Now today, we have also quite a few Christians who believe that the Jews must be set up again in Jerusalem before the Christ can come. And this is a time in which we live that is very similar to the time that was there at the time of Constantine. And as I've been studying the history of the early Christian church, to try to prepare in a short discourse this subject, there are so many parallels between that time and what we're facing today that it is quite astounding. Last time I mentioned in the privilege I had of speaking to you about the inclusive church. So the inclusive church is that church which we just spoke about, where everybody in the society belongs to that particular religion. But Jesus himself, in Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 through 36, said something that implied very strongly what he also said in John chapter 17, that we as a people, as believers, are to be in the society, but not of the society. So one of the sayings of Christ here, we'll just read it in part. It says, "Think not that I am come to send peace upon the earth." And he goes on to say, "I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and a daughter against her mother," and so forth. And he said, "A man's foes shall be those of his own household." So in the early church, this statement was a declaration of a new concept of society. In it, Jesus set forth the concept of a composite society, a society within a society. It was that it was as if a man within his own house was to become a stranger, and therefore that the family of God would be a stranger within the world. And they even said, there was the idea that, a false idea, I might say, that as the soul was in the body, so the Christians were in the world. That was an analogy that they used in the 3rd century, to tell us that we are in the world but not to be of the world, because it was the faith of the believer that determined whether or not he was to be considered a child of God. Not that you could be sprinkled or baptized and become a Christian and be saved from sin. You had to believe. And the thing that we know about the first Christian centuries was that there was a lot of persecution. Why was there persecution? Because the Christians stood outside of the social norms of that time, believing in one God and worshiping Jesus Christ and Him alone. While the Romans had many gods and expected the people to actually be committed to the society. Now, we talk about certain emperors who were, we would call, very terrible. Emperors who persecuted the Christians especially. But from the Roman point of view, these terrible persecutors were actually the most faithful of the Roman emperors. Why? Because they tried to purify society and bring back the success of the culture through moral reformations. And they did that by cleansing the church, their church, of the heretics. And the heretics were primarily, in this point, the Christians, because the Christians did not believe in worshiping emperors or making libations to the gods. But the prevailing point was faith, and faith was tested by trial. Today, we are being tested. Today, we are looking at our own situations, and we are challenged. We are challenged to exercise faith in what? In the divine providence of God, that God is going to work out things in His way and His time. But what do we want to do? Many times, we try to help God by justifying ourselves or others, or interfering in ways that are of our own ideas, and not coming to the point where we leave God as head of our lives, of the lives of others, and of the church. Now, there was a heresy in the early church, but this heresy was not a heresy. Now, they did believe some things that we don't believe, but the one thing that these people believed was that the church was to be made up of those who had faith in God, and those who did not have faith in God were tested. And the greatest trial that the early church had was not the trial of persecution, but what to do with those people who had denied their faith and then wanted to be a member in the church after the persecution ceased. What do we do with these people who compromised what they believed or said they believed to save their own skin, and then wanted to be members of the church afterwards? And there were different solutions to that, and it was very hard for the church to decide whether to accept these people back as members or not, because we know from Christ's own experience that He caused the crisis in Galilee and caused the 70 to leave, to go away, because they were going to be a special thorn in the side of those people who were faithful in the time of the end. And I appreciated the meeting last night because it talked about the shaking, that God is shaking His church to purify it, that those who don't trust in God, those who are looking to themselves and to their own wisdom and their own thinking to try to correct things in their own way, these people are going to cause more trouble for God's people in the time of the end, because they will also give up their faith because they didn't get things the way they wanted them or thought they should be, like Judas. So we need to realize we live in a testing time. We need to understand that we have to learn how to have faith in every situation, no matter what other people do or we think their motive may be. We have to come to peace with God ourselves. And we have to learn to trust Him, even when others aren't. I'm sure you've heard of Balaam. He's mentioned in the early church, along with the Nicolaitans. You know, I found this word interesting as I was researching it, the Nicolaitans. What does Nicolaitans mean? Well, if you go to the etymology of the word, what it really means, it's from the word, a Greek word, which means, Nico means, where is that now? According to, I think. And I've got that wrong. Nicolaitans, Nico means according to. Laitans means the people. So according to, or it actually means submission to the rule. Nico means you submit to me and you're okay. Laetans means that people need to submit to the ruling powers. That's really what it meant. And in this time of the early Christian church, now the Nicolaitans are mentioned in the early church in Ephesus period and also in Pergamos. So we find that these people, these Nicolaitans, what were they against? In Pergamos, we find a period of the church where the church turned upside down society so much that the church now became the religion of the state. How is it that it went from being the heretic to being the standard by which people were to be judged? So they went from one extreme to the other. The church now became the one who was the authority. And the Nicolaitans were the ones who were supporting that change. And there were I don't know if you've ever heard of Origen. Any of you heard of Origen? He's one of the early church fathers, has interesting history. He lived about 250, and he was supporting, before it happened, he was supporting the idea that if the emperor would give in to Christianity, that God would bless Rome and make them champions in their war with others. He was supporting that idea. Now, Tertullian was against that idea, and he said, what has the emperor to do with the church? And that was a famous saying for 1,200 years. What has the emperor to do with the church? So what we had in the beginning of the church at this period was that the church turned the world upside down, but the church was destroyed by the process, because what Satan couldn't accomplish by persecuting the church, but only made it spread, he accomplished by coming into the church and joining it with the world. And that's what we're fighting against today in very subtle ways. Now, I don't know, have you heard of the Apostles' Creed? Have you heard of the Apostles' Creed? At the beginning, in the first 200 or 300, 400 years, and even today, the Apostles' Creed is still there. What the church did, what the true people did, was they espoused to the what's called the Apostles' Creed. It's a very simple statement of faith. It's very similar to what we have in the Sabbath Watchman, a very simple summary of our beliefs. It's very close to the Apostles' Creed. We believe in God. We believe in Jesus Christ, his Son. We believe in the Holy Spirit. We believe that Christ was born by Mary by a virgin birth, that he rose, that he died and rose again and is ministering in heaven on our behalf. That's basically the Apostles' Creed with a few more words. But during this period, they put some things in the Apostles' Creed. Instead of that Christ died for the church, the Holy Church, they put in the Apostles' Creed the Holy Catholic Church. And if you go to the Inquisitions of that time, what you will find in the records of the Inquisitions is that the heretics would not say Catholic when they repeated the Apostles' Creed. Why? Because the word Catholic means universal church. So what they were against primarily was the idea that you have parishes, and everybody in that parish is belonging to the church, and you're subject to the leadership and the rules and the decisions of your bishop, of your priest. No, they said. Our religion must be a personal relationship with God. No amens? Our religion must be a personal relationship with God. So we find that one thing that was prevailing in the heretics was their refusal to go along with this idea of the parish church. Now I'm simplifying things quite a bit here because the information is astounding. But one of the things that I did not read in my research was that of the place that a man named Eusebius played in this role of the church becoming the universal church. Eusebius had a very special place in the movement of the church becoming the universal church. Now, what did he do, Eusebius? Well, for one thing, Eusebius was quite a scholar. He knew Greek, he knew Hebrew, he knew Latin, and he was commissioned because of his friendship with Constantine to produce a manuscript of the Greek Bible that would unite the kingdom, that would unite the world then. Now, you might say, well, what does that have to do with us? Why should we be studying that? Well, if you'll give me just 5 minutes, I'll tell you. But we have the work of Eusebius here. This is the work of Eusebius. What is this called? This is called, what is it? Can you read it from there? Not with the page closed. The Codex Vaticanus. Okay? This is the work of Eusebius. What is this? Codex Sinaiticus. You know where this came from? Anybody have any idea? Anybody heard of Tischendorf? They were using this book on Mount Sinai to start their fires in the morning to get warm. When Tischendorf went to Mount Sinai, he found that, and that was one of the copies that Eusebius made to unite the kingdom. Now, he made 50 of these copies. He hired people to do that. And I have a book here called God's Power and His Authority, and I'm just going to read one paragraph. It has 2 sentences about these books. It might surprise you, and I'm going to tell you why it's significant. In the Gospels alone, Codex Vaticanus differs from the revised text. Now, what is the revised text? The revised text is what made this book. And who's primarily responsible, Brother Suarez? Tyndale and others. Wycliffe started it, but Tyndale, who died for his faith in 1535 or 36, burned at the stake for translating this Bible out of the original text. What Eusebius did was he hired scribes to copy his original text. And these men were not scribes. They were just copiers. They didn't even know what they were writing, according to what some people said, because they made so many mistakes. But that's not the biggest problem. In the Gospel alone, Codex Vaticanus differs from the received text in that it omits at least 2,877 words. Now, I might say that those words have to do with the nature of Christ and the Holy Spirit primarily. It adds 536 words and substitutes 935 words. It transposes 2,098 words. And it modifies 1,132 words, making a total of 7,578 modifications and divergences from the received text. But the Sinaiticus manuscript is even worse, for its total divergencies, in particular stated above, amount to nearly 9,000 differences from the received text. Now, is that important? Probably not for most people. But the interesting thing is that these manuscripts are the very oldest manuscripts that we have of the Bible. There are no older manuscripts. So therefore, they are considered the most original and the most trustworthy, and therefore the standard of modern translations. But let me explain that when the copiers were translating the manuscripts which we have, when those old manuscripts were no longer credible, they were destroyed. So they copied copies and copied copies. But when the old manuscripts were no longer credible, what did they do with them? They burned them. They got rid of them because they weren't trustworthy anymore. Do you know how they did that? How they copied? They counted letter by letter, word by word, line by line. And if it didn't line up, if it was more than 3 mistakes in the count, they would not accept the manuscript. So what we have of the received text is something like 3,500 texts from the received text that are not as old as the manuscripts as those, but they have 3,500 witnesses to say that what we had was true. Now, the point of what I'm making, what I'm saying here is, do you know that there are people who have gone on a campaign to have as many Bible translations as possible based upon what? Based upon these older manuscripts. What is this causing? This is causing confusion in the Christian world. It's causing skepticism among young people, and it's causing people to lose their faith in the trustworthiness of the Bible. What does Jesus say in the last days? That they would, shall I find faith on the earth when I come. And yet God in his mercy is rising up out of the ashes and out of the rocks of archaeology to prove that the history of the Bible is correct. Now, if we study and understand the process that has gone through in the early Christian church to bring about a uniting of society under what we call in Europe the Great Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire is what it used to be, we see now that the conflicts and the degeneration of society that's happening in our world today was similar to that of Rome. And there's an effort being made behind the scenes to correct this, and there's only one way that man knows how to correct it: a political solution to the moral problem. And will that work? What is the difference? The simple difference, my friends, is that we must cease to try to find political solutions to our own problems, to the problems within the church, and realize that the solution is Jesus Christ alone. He is our answer. Our faith must be in him. We are being tried. We are being tested. Are we going to trust in God? Are we going to justify ourselves? Are we going to condemn our brethren? Are we going to go our own way? Is self going to be the center of our religion, of our prayers, of our songs, of our preaching? Or is Jesus Christ going to be the center? We have to make a decision. We have to choose. We need to test ourselves whether we are in the faith. Now, I'm quoting from a modern translation here. A modern translation. But this modern translation happens to be based on the original text, not on the Vaticanus, and the Sinaiticus. It says, test yourselves whether you are in the faith. Not just you have faith, but you need to be in it. Give yourselves an examination. Or do you not recognize of yourselves that Christ Jesus is within you? Unless you are counterfeits. Now, this word counterfeits in this translation is a little bit further away than the real word, which in the King James Version is reprobates. It means, this word actually means approved or tried. So in the context, it really means unless you are tried. Unless you are tested. Are you being tested? Are you being tested to trust in God? And how are you doing with that test? How am I doing with that test? Brothers and sisters, when I was studying this, I could not find a way to bring the magnitude of the issue to you. All I could do was pray and ask God to work in this moment. That we realize that we're going to face a great controversy, a very serious controversy. There's a lot of deception in our world today. But what do we need? Let's close our meeting with a word from the Old Testament, if you will, please. We're going to go to Zechariah, to that famous place there in chapter Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 3. I want you to think about something. First of all, Job said in Job chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. But I will maintain mine own ways before him. Then he goes on to say, he shall be my salvation. We know we've failed to grasp the heart of the gospel when the sins of others are more important and more centered than our own. Oh, that men, instead of dwelling upon the faults and errors of their brethren, had talked with God concerning their own dangers and defects of character. This is taking from Special Testimonies B, number 2, page 27. She goes on to talk about then the vision in Zechariah. And she asks us all to be more forgiving as God has been forgiving toward us. That we would express thanksgiving for the God's revelation of our own sins and faults. A picture is presented here, she says, of Zechariah, that he showed Joshua as the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, standing at the right hand to resist him was Satan. So compare this picture with the experience of some today. Do we not, in many ways and words, vindicate ourselves and condemn others? We read in verse 2 and 3 and 4. And the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, O Satan. Even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and stood before the angel. Verse 4. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, take away the filthy garment from him. And unto him he said, behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee. I will clothe thee with change of raiment. we ourselves need to act as Christ did in our minds. Every one of us needs a change of raiment. Every one of us must be cleansed, refined, ennobled, covered with the robe of Christ's righteousness. Every one of us may be cleansed. Heavenly angels are waiting, even in our midst. Christ is interceding personally on your behalf, on your family's behalf, on your friends' behalf. Victories will be given to us if we look at our own defects instead of pointing to the defects of others. She goes on to say, in the same statement, by empowering his people to employ the argument of his name. Interesting statement. The argument of his name. And I thought, Proverbs 18 verse 10, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it and is safe. And Jesus said, whatsoever he shall ask in my name, that will I do it, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. This is John chapter 14, verse 13, and verse 14 says, if she'll ask anything in my name, and I will do it. Jesus says this 5 times. 5 times. He asks us to do that. The incense of his righteousness is ours. He distinctly pledges himself to answer our supplications. But justifying ourselves, he can't do that. Finding fault with others, he can't do that. And when we do that, we encourage, she goes on to say, the evil angels to abide with us and to unite with them in the warfare against God's people, earnestly pleading with God for the holy fragrance of the character of Christ is of value. So, what are we to say? Christ's intercession prevails with God and at the same time is the almoner, she says, of infinite grace. Now, what's an almoner? An almoner is a free giver, a giver of grace. Almoner is where we get alms deeds. So Christ's intercession prevails with God as an almoner of infinite grace, as a sweet incense, a holy fragrance that can be ours. And that holy fragrance was in the sanctuary, and it spilled over not only into the most holy place, but it spilled out into the courtyard, and it could be smelled among the people. And so, as we learn to love one another, and as God has said when we're studying about that in our lessons, how we deal with one another, we can have this holy incense and grow in that faith that will take us through the time we're going to come to when the whole world is turned upside down and we are forced to be a part of a religious movement which we cannot be a part of and be on God's side. So let us practice now to limit our words, and as David said in Sabbath school this morning, give yourself 3 seconds, what your mom said, to speak before we speak, to have more patience, that we might uplift one another and uplift each other in prayer before God, because we're going to need each other in that time. We're going to need each other. We need each other now. So let's take off our shoes and walk quietly and softly in the presence of our brother and in the presence of Jesus Christ and what he is doing to prepare us for that day. Let's not resist him. He's working. We may not like what is happening, but we will like the results, I guarantee you. I guarantee you're going to like the results when you yield to his leading and to his providences. He does nothing for nothing. Let us trust in him. Amen.
Thank you very much, Brother Watts. I think he missed out something to mention. These codices are available at our publishing department. Those who like to have them, you can order, and Brother Watts will be delighted to make.